Dragons in the Waters by Madeleine L'Engle. 2. The First Night at Sea. Charles and Dr. O'Keefe shared the second double cabin on the starboard corridor, and Polly had the first single cabin next to theirs. She was in bed reading, happy with her compact little nest, barely big enough for bunk, chest of drawers, wash basin. On the chest she had propped her favorite travel companion, an ancient icon of St. George battling the dragon, which she had taken from a calendar and mounted on a thin piece of wood. Wherever she had St. George, she felt at home, and protected from all dragons, real or imaginary. A brisk, rhythmic knocking came on the door, the family knock, and Charles entered, wearing pajamas and bathrobe. "Hi, what are you reading?" "Wuthering Heights." "Would I like it?" "Not yet." "I'm not that much younger than you are." "You're a boy, and you wouldn't like it yet," she stated dogmatically. Charles let it drop, looked around for a place to sit, and then climbed up onto the foot of her bunk and sat cross-legged, lotus position. "I like it when you sit that way," Polly said. "It's comfortable." "And you didn't even know it was a special position used by Eastern holy men when they meditate?" "How would I know? It's a good position for thinking in." "What do you think of Simon, then?" Charles smiled his slow smile. "I've never met anybody before who wasn't in our century." "What do you mean?" "Aunt Leonis. He belongs to wherever it was she belonged to, and maybe it wasn't a whole century ago, but it certainly isn't now." "We have to take care of him then, don't we?" Charles was silent for so long that Polly thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, "Someone has to. I don't think Cousin Forsyth is going to." Polly looked interested. "What about Cousin Forsyth?" "What Simon's Aunt Leonis calls a sense of smell." "What about it?" "I'm not sure. Maybe it's not Cousin Forsyth, but my sense of smell is giving me warnings." "About what?" "I'm not sure, Paul. I just get a sense of anger and fear, and it's coming at me from all directions. Too many pheromones." "Have you spoken to Daddy?" "Not yet. It isn't definite enough." Polly looked at her brother with absolute seriousness. "I don't like it when you get feelings." "I like it if they're good ones." "But this isn't. It's strange. I've never felt anything like it before. It seems to come from almost everybody, and to have something to do with Cousin Forsyth. And that just doesn't make sense. I wish you'd speak to Daddy." "I will if anything begins to focus. It's all vague and fuzzy now." "What about Simon?" "Simon is our friend," Charles said. Simon lay awake in his bunk. Cousin Forsyth snored. Simon had never slept in a room with anyone else before. In Pharaoh, he and Aunt Leonis each had a private cubicle, his made out of what had originally been a small storeroom. He was afraid to move about lest he disturb Cousin Forsyth. He started to drift into sleep and woke up with a jerk, dreaming that the forklift was pursuing him, and the forklift was alive and wild and hungry, with red eyes and smoke, like a dragon. Simon was prone to occasional nightmares, and at home he would go out to the kitchen and brew a cup of tea, and Aunt Leonis always heard him and came out to him, and they would sit and drink tea and talk until the nightmare had dissolved in the warm light of the kitchen, and he could go back to bed and sleep. Cousin Forsyth's snoring was rhythmic and placid, but it was not a restful sound. Then the Orion began to rock gently in the night, swells of the ocean, and this living movement was as comforting as the lit candle in the kitchen at Pharaoh. Thoughts of forklifts and dragons receded, and he went to sleep. In the cottage at Pharaoh, Miss Leonis was reading by the bright light of the resiny fire. On a small table by her side lay her Bible, closed. She was not certain that consulting it had caused her to make her decision to open Quentin Fair's letters and journals, unread for so many generations, instead of waiting to leave them for Simon. But ever since Mrs. O'Keefe had dropped her at Pharaoh, after an exhausting and stimulating afternoon, she had been restless and unable to settle down. Her sense of smell kept telling her that something was wrong, but not what that something was, except that it had to do with Simon. Simon, who was miles away at sea in a small freighter heading into the Caribbean. Had she been right to accept Forsyth Farr's invitation to take his young cousin to Caracas with him? It would be a journey of less than 2 weeks. They would be returning by plane after leaving the portrait in Caracas. Surely this was an opportunity for for Simon which should not be turned down. Something was wrong. Something is wrong, an inner voice continued to nag. Simon is in danger. Had her concern over Simon's future dulled her sense of smell over Forsyth? He had come with documents tracing his descent from one of her great uncles who had moved out west after the war. She knew that this shared ancestor had undoubtedly played politics with the carpetbaggers, but Forsyth Fair was not to be blamed for that. After all, and perhaps, it was old-fashioned prejudice which made her hold this against him. In any event, Forsyth was a Fair. His nose and chin told her that, the high-bridged, hawk-like nose, though Forsyth's eyes crowded close together, unlike the wide-spaced Fair eyes. But he had the strong chin, softened by an unexpected dimple, which usually turned into a formidable cleft by middle age. In Forsyth, the cleft was almost a scar. Yes, he was a Fair, and hanky-panky with those who wanted to get rich on the troubles of the South was hardly to be blamed on him. His talk of his life in Caracas sounded serious, and surely it was commendable that he wanted to return the portrait to his adopted country rather than to keep it for himself. And then, Forsyth was the last of the Fairs. Simon was a Rainier. The male line of Fairs had been prone to accident and sudden death. Pride of name, she thought wryly. Is that part of it? Pride. Pride was always her downfall. When Simon's mother died, she had concealed the fact of her poverty from the Rainier relatives. They had wanted the boy to come to them, to his father's people. She had had to battle to keep him, and she respected the Rainiers for letting Simon, in the end, make the choice. They would be ready to take him to their hearts when she died. They would see to it that he was properly educated, that he went to medical school. If she had asked them for money, they would have given it to her. If she had asked them to buy the portrait, they would have bought it. But then she might have lost Simon. Pride. Forsyth Fair was Simon's one link with his mother's kin, and Miss Leonis with Quentin Fair, indeed with the very name of Fair. Not only pride was involved in her feelings here, the dying of a name was as real as the death of a person. If Simon kept in touch with Forsyth Fair, it would keep his name alive a little longer. I'm a foolish, proud old woman, she thought. In eternity, the end of the Fairs makes no never mind. She was suddenly full of misgivings. Was Forsyth really all that he appeared to be? Had pride of name made her too eager to accept this kind and considerate stranger who had appeared out of the blue? She fed old Boz, and then walked slowly around the house with him. There had been sunshine in Charleston that afternoon, and the air was warmer, but now the sun had set, and she was glad to get back to the fire. She reached for her Bible. It opened to Nehemiah, and the first words she read were, And Tobiah sent letters to put me in fear. This could hardly be construed as a suggestion that she opened Quentin Fair's letters and journals. Besides, she considered people who opened the Bible, put a pin on a word, and expected an answer to their problem to be superstitious at the least, and idolatrous at the worst, and she wished to be neither. What do you think, old Boz? She fondled the dog's ear. The old hound sighed and put his chin heavily on her knee. Then he walked arithmetically into her small bedroom, where she kept the carved wooden coffer, which had once contained jewels and now held Quentin Fair's journals and letters. After a few moments, she followed the dog. She took the 2 journals and a few packets of letters from the coffer and returned to the fire. She took one of the journals out of its oilskin casing and opened it at random. The ink was brown and faded, but the script was elegant and still completely legible. She read, When I returned from Dragon Lake today, Umara showed me our baby. It was an extraordinary feeling to take this tiny brown thing in my arms and to know that he is my seed, that his fair skin comes from me. Now I have shot my man and begot my man. I am not the first, nor will I be the last of the English regiment to leave my seed here on Venezuelan soil, but my Umara is not like the usual women we soldiers meet. Indeed, the Quistanos seem like a race apart as well as a world apart, a gentler world. I do not want to leave my son, my first son, here in this strange place, but I cannot send my Umara home to my mother in cold England. Why am I so unduly disturbed by what, after all, is nothing unusual? Miss Leonis closed her eyes. She sat unmoving until the fire died down and the room grew cold and the old dog began to whine. In the cabin, next to Cousin Forsyth, Simon and the two professors prepared for bed. In the cabin next to Cousin Forsyth and Simon, the two professors prepared for bed. Dr. Wordsworth was brushing strong black tea through her luxuriant hair. Geraldo left her a pot of tea in the cabin each evening immediately after he had cleaned up demitasse and glasses. I learned about brushing black tea into my hair at bedtime from an Armenian ballet dancer, she said, and I don't have any gray, which at my age is not bad. Dr. Eisenstein had heard about the black tea before. She looked at herself in the mirror, not pleased with what she saw. She reached for her toothbrush. At least she had all her teeth, which was more than Inez could say. The brownish circles under her eyes did not vanish when she had enough sleep. The steady lines about her mouth and nose were graven deep, too much staring into books and not enough living. But when she could not see herself, her inner mirror gave her a younger, more pleasant image. She did not feel nearly 60. She brushed her teeth vigorously, and for a moment she was intensely irritated by Inez's glossy black tresses. Dr. Wordsworth patted her cheeks with cotton soaked in astringent lotion. She sighed. I wish Fair hadn't come aboard at Savannah. It's brought up a past I hoped I could forget. He seems very pleasant, Dr. Eisenstein said. Dr. Wordsworth's voice was bitter. If you will remember, my youth in Caracas was not exactly happy. I have deliberately tried to forget as much as possible. I know, Dr. Eisenstein murmured. You don't know. You didn't know, Fernando. I know what you told me. I know he treated you abominably and made you very unhappy. Dr. Wordsworth laughed harshly. Ha! That's putting it mildly. I don't know why I let myself be talked into coming along with you on this trip. Inez, it's supposed to be a rest for both of us. Dr. Wordsworth yawned elaborately, patting her wide-open mouth with her scarlet-tipped fingers. I'm exhausted, all right, and I admit to being curious about your Cristanos. Fernando was mostly Levantine, but he had a touch of Cristano in him. You're still trying to understand him, Dr. Eisenstein said softly. Dr. Wordsworth finished wiping off her face cream and threw out the astringent-soaked cotton. No, Ruth, I'm trying to understand myself. Then why are you so upset about meeting an old acquaintance? I don't feel logical about my past, and he reminds me of it. He appears to be very much of a gentleman, and he plays an excellent game of bridge, as long as he doesn't presume on more acquaintance. I'm sure he won't, Dr. Eisenstein reassured. Anyhow, it's only a few more days till we depart at Port of Dragons, and he goes on to Caracas. Dr. Wordsworth got under the covers. I look forward to your Cristanos, Ruth. 20th century civilization has lost its appeal for me. Dr. Eisenstein put her notebooks away. She felt a stirring of envy. Fernando may have caused Inez great pain, but at least she knew life and love. There had never been a Fernando in Dr. Eisenstein's life, and she felt the poorer for it. Simon was awakened by his cousin's strenuous breathing. It was so loud that Simon smiled into the darkness, because it seemed a strange and primitive sound to be coming from Cousin Forsyth. He thought of the two professors in the next cabin and wondered if they could hear it through the walls, and what kind of conversation two such different people as Dr. Eisenstein and Dr. Wordsworth would have with each other. After Simon and Cousin Forsyth was cabin 5, the cabin with the portrait, the Bolivar portrait, which was the reason for this journey. The thought that once they left Caracas he would never see the portrait again gave him a sharp pang of regret. Pride of possession, he thought. Aunt Leonis told me to beware of that. Cousin Forsyth gave an extra loud snort, which evidently woke him up. Simon could hear him turn over in his bunk and start to breathe quietly. He lay in a strange bed on his way to a strange land. Now that the snoring had stopped, he could hear again the soothing sound of wind and wave. He remembered that he had new friends on board. He tried to feel adventurous and brave like Quentin Fair. He tried to feel that one day he too might be a hero. The ship rocked like a cradle. He closed his eyes, turned over, and returned to sleep. And that is the end of chapter 2.